Welcome to the Explorers Podcast with Ken Boa. Here, Ken connects with friends and peers to discuss issues in the world and practices to improve one's biblical perspective.
Welcome to Explorers. This is Kenneth Boa, and I'm with my guest, Eddie Staub, who is the founder of Eagle Ranch. And Eddie, I wanted to ask you how that even came to pass. And we have a little bit of a history together. We're going over the years on that topic, and let's see where that goes.
Okay. Well, the question I'm most often asked is why did I start Eagle Ranch, and why did I come to Georgia, right? Yes. I'm from Alabama, but someone said there's some time in our childhood when a door opens and lets the future in. Yeah. And I think, I don't know that that's true for everybody, Ken, but it was for me. For as long as I can remember, I was struck by how blessed I was growing up. I had a mom and a mother and a father who were committed to me. We had a roof over our head. We were never in want. And for the longest time, I said, everybody lives like this. And then I went to Auburn and got involved in the Big Brother program and, went into the inner city and out into the real poor rural areas. And I just had this epiphany, Ken, that not only was my life not the rule, but it was the exception. And the only reason I have what I have, or you have what you had, is because of the grace of God.
Grace of God.
And there is no such thing as a self-made man or woman. I mean, the framework for success has been laid apart from our own striving. And in my own, how God blessed me, little Eddie Staub growing up outside Birmingham, it just went to a very deep place in me, such that I knew that my life had to be about helping those who struggled in life. It didn't really become focused on children until much later, but it's almost as like, their story sort of became my story in a way, the pain that they felt, and it just went to a very deep place in me. So that was one part of it. The other is I can never remember not loving God.
Huh.
And I was raised Catholic and, went to confirmation, and confirmation wasn't perfunctory for me. I really believed and confirmed my faith, and then got involved in Young Life when I was a senior, and it sort of helped me semantically define my faith.
Yes, understand the gospel and its conditions and terms more clearly, perhaps, in some contexts.
Exactly. You're exactly right. And then I went to Auburn. My father died when I was a sophomore, and all of a sudden my mortality sort of came front and center. And I was playing baseball at Auburn, and after practice I would walk up to this little church that stayed open 24/7, and I did that for about 3 weeks. And it's not something that college kids do, but I just knew God was calling me to that place away. And I'd sit in those pews, Ken, and sometimes I'd fall asleep, sometimes I would daydream, but there are other times I just really was communing with God about life. And I thought about that verse in Mark that said Simon and Andrew were mending their nets, for they were fishermen, and Jesus walked onto the beach of their life and said, "Follow me." And it said immediately they dropped their nets and followed him. And I started thinking about Jesus walking onto the beach of my life in that little chapel. And I went, there's 3 ways you can answer this. No, I'm not going to follow you. Yes, I'll follow you, but I'm going to drag my nets just in case you aren't who you say you are. Or yes. And I just wanted to say yes. And to do something that could only be accomplished through the power of God. And that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob is still operative in this world.
Yes.
And I wanted to see that personally. So those were the two reasons for starting Eagle Ranch, was a heart for hurting people and also wanting to see God do something so great
Yes.
that, as John Haggai said, is doomed to failure unless God be
That's
in it.
right. The way we grow our faith is precisely by committing ourselves to projects that will fail unless God shows up.
You're exactly
and so
right.
then we grow and build. But that whole thing that you've described is a great gift, a double gift. The first gift you described is the gift that you didn't realize you had.
Mm-hmm.
You took what you were experiencing, which was not the norm, but really a remarkably rich, textured, nurturing environment with family and security and understanding. And then in your discovery as a college student that that's not the norm.
Mm.
And then to realize all of life is gift and grace, everything. What do we have that wasn't given to us? I have to say, my friend, that the verse that came to mean the most to me along this very line, I'm sure it's for you too, 1 Corinthians 4:7, when he says, what do you have that you weren't given? Then why do you boast as if it wasn't given to you? That nails it all.
Yeah.
I have nothing and you don't have it. But what grace of God, even the grace to choose that way, which most people would decline. That too is the grace of God, and I can't understand why it is, but you've been given a very clear call, and I had a similar situation in my own life journey as well, and it was a clear call, and I can't attribute why does that happen to some and not to others, but it's a matter of grace. It's not a matter of desert. And so you were given this sense of clarity, and then you reached out into the future, as you say. How did you put that before? You were taking a step into the future that God had put before you.
You know, it's just, it's in Zechariah, I think. It says, don't despise small beginnings, for the Lord rejoices when you begin the journey.
Yeah.
And it's just, I had enough faith for the next step. And sometimes I wanted to give up, but there was always something, I believe, from God that helped me take the next step, and then the next step. And if I had looked way down the road, I don't think I would have had the faith to do Eagle Ranch.
Yeah,
but
he
it
gives
was
it to
enough.
you as you need it, isn't
Yeah.
it? It's like with Abraham. He could not have been the man who left Ur of the Chaldees, great as that was not the man ready to sacrifice his son. That took a long process of hearing that voice and responding. I think it's true with you. Each time you hear it, you're able to hear it with greater clarity. And so it's a progressive understanding, isn't it?
Yeah, it very much is.
Yeah.
There's those Pauline experiences.
We'll have that.
But that's more the exception than the rule.
It is.
Yeah.
I think that's right.
Yeah.
So where did this lead? So what year was this when this
This was,
occurred?
I came to Georgia in July 9th of 1982.
82. Wow.
Yeah, and I had my car and my clothes and the money I saved for the 2 years I was teaching high school, so I had my car and my clothes. And I stayed at Ignatius' house.
Yes.
My father had studied to be a Jesuit priest for 13 years, and he had studied with Father Schroeder.
I see.
And when I was coming to Georgia, I said, Mom, I don't know where I'm going to stay. And she goes, well, call Father Schroeder. He studied with your dad in the Jesuit track. So I called Father Schroeder and I said, this is Eddie Staub. And he goes, are you brother's son? And I said, yes. And he goes, I said, I need a place to stay. He said, well, you can stay here for 2 months. And I stayed at Ignatius' house. And I'll tell you, the people ask me, Ken, what's the hardest thing I've experienced? And you know, the first thing they go, money or credibility or getting people to believe in your vision. But it really wasn't. The hardest thing I had to fight with were my motives. Why did I want to do this at a real, almost visceral level?
Yeah.
And I was at Ignatius' house, and it had to be the Holy Spirit that just really convicted me. Eddie, why are you doing this? And I thought it was for the right reasons, but I felt like I needed to go through the pain of unearthing why. And I went down to their little chapel for 2 days, and it was horrible because I went into it knowing that if my motives were awful, then I was leaving. I was going back home, and I told people in Georgia I was doing this, people in Alabama, and can you imagine just saying, well, I wanted to do this, but my motives were terrible, and so I decided. So this is what I came to, that in the midst of that, there was ego, there was pride, there was wanting to prove myself. And I went to Randy Pope, who you know Randy.
Sure.
And I was just sort of befuddled. I said, Randy, I don't know what to do with this. I've got ego in this and pride. And I said, it's not a big part, but it's just part of who I am. And I can't get past it. He says, well, Eddie, just joined the human race. And it's almost as if Eagle Ranch began then, because I felt free that my core desire was to bring glory to God.
Yes.
That is... And so
that was good counsel for you, because there's a certain thing. If you go on an archaeological dig into the substrata of your subconscious motives, you're not sure if you'll ever come out of there alive. Because who can know? You start examining it, and then maybe that's not it, and so forth. So, and yet there's also, we know this is true. There's an iceberg, and we don't see what's below the waterline, but God knows. But He already understands. We're never going to surprise Him, but He'll reveal that to us as we're ready to receive it, as some of the material then it evaporates. And when that happens, that exact amount of mass rises to the surface, and that's material that wasn't visible before. And so the process continues in the iceberg of our lives.
And it really takes stillness of your spirit, because if you don't have stillness of your spirit, you'll never experience that.
I think you're right.
Yeah, because there's so much of the seen world that's seductive.
Yeah.
And you've got to be still for the unseen.
The quiet voice and training yourself. And that's maybe a topic we can look at a little bit later. But listening and training yourself to hear the quiet prompts of the Spirit of God, because as we respond to that quiet voice, that obedience amplifies it slightly. And so each act either amplifies it or diminishes it. And so in your life journey, it's an interesting series of prompts that the Spirit of God has given to you. And so that's been a journey of desire that you've had. Yeah. Continue on then. So this is where Randy then kind of liberates you.
Yes. Yeah. And then I had a week before I had to leave Ignatius' house, and I didn't know anybody in Atlanta, except one guy who was at Chick-fil-A. I had spoken at their devotion a year before, and I ran into him in Atlanta. And he goes, Eddie, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm trying to start a children's home. And he goes, well, where are you staying? I go, well, I know where I'm staying one more week, and then I don't have a place to go. And he said, Eddie, there's a guy at Chick-fil-A who's leaving and going to North Carolina, and he needs someone to house sit in Powder Springs for 6 months.
Wow. I
know. So I ended up in Powder Springs. There wasn't hardly any furnishings in the home, but it was home for me.
Yes.
And then this is what happened, Ken. It's amazing how God takes you to the end of yourself. And so only He can resurrect. It's like in a way, the valley of the shadow of death. That's sort of the dark night of the soul. But I was up in Cartersville. I was meeting with a pastor of one of the largest churches there, telling him what I wanted to do. And he goes, and after I'd finished, he says, son, how much money do you have? And I said, I have $25. And he goes, I don't want to hurt your feelings, but dreamers like you walk into my office once a week. And he said, if you're asking me, I think you just need to go home. It's obvious God's not in this. So
he had the real gift of encouragement.
Well, So I got in my car, backed into a telephone pole.
Oh, my word.
Crushed the whole, and I'm headed back down to Powder Springs, where I have literally 1 week to go. And I remember getting back to that house, Ken, and there was just a sofa in the main room, and I put my back against the sofa, and I said, God, you've made a fool out of me. I left everything for you. and people are laughing at me here. They're laughing at me in Alabama. And I said, I've got 1 week and it's over. I quit. If you want to show me something, I need to know something. If not, I'm going home. The next morning I was praying. It was 8:14, and a man from up around Gainesville called. Don't even now know how he got my number. And he said, "Is this Eddie Staub?" I said, "Yeah, yes it is." And he goes, "This is so and so." And he said, "What are you doing, son?" I said, "Well, I'm praying." And he said, "Well, get off your knees." And I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "I've got some financial resources for you, and there are other people up in Gainesville that want to do the same thing." So I was completely, and what was so wonderful is God can handle our anger.
Yes.
And that was a bit of an epiphany for me.
Yeah, that's a big thing.
Because, we tend to get enrolled with Jesus and God as if he doesn't know.
Yeah. It's amazing, isn't it?
And then when I was just at the end of myself, that he affirmed, and what is so wonderful, Ken, is, and I've always told our staff, remembrance is the key to faith.
Yes.
And when we have this budget we do, I never hardly worry anymore because I've seen God's deliverance in the past. And he doesn't change. The economy doesn't change him. He is who he is. And the God who sort of delivered me in those early days and provided places to stay and food to eat or whatever is the same God who's with us today. So, and what I love is the people in Gainesville. I was asking people to support the ranch, and it we had to buy the land and everything. And so one of the gentlemen up in Gainesville knew a man named Sonny Ellis. Sonny was the retiring CFO of Genuine Parts, and he was really a gatekeeper in corporate giving and foundation giving. And so the folks in Gainesville said, "Sonny, will you please meet with this guy and just vet him for us? Because his plans are ambitious. We just need to know if he's, a charlatan."
Yeah.
And so I called Mr. Ellis, and I said, "Mr. Ellis, this is Eddie Staub. I've been asked to meet with you." And he goes, "Well, I'll be glad to meet with you." He goes, "Before you come, send me your business plan." I said, "Okay." And I hung up the phone. I go, what's a business plan? And then I thought, Ken, I said, I bet it has something to do with numbers.
Yeah. Astute observation.
I know. Yeah. So I put together a one-page pro forma and went down to meet with him. And he said, "Did you bring your business plan?" I said, "Yes, sir. Here it is." And he looked at it, and he is the quintessential Southern gentleman, right? So he's looking at my quote-unquote business plan for about 5 minutes. And he's brilliant. So he already figured everything out. And he pushed it across the desk, and he said some words that are the most encouraging words I've heard in 40 years to me. And he said simply this. He said, "Eddie," he said, "what you want to do is impossible, but I'm not taking into account what God can do through you and through others." And the reason that was so encouraging to me, because that just resonated with the heart of who I am. That when this happened, it wouldn't be about Eddie Staub, it wouldn't be about a board, but it'd be about the Lord bringing something into being. So that and then Eagle Ranch basically got started from there.
That's
so,
astonishing, though.
Yeah.
But so he could even see that. So again, God seems to have raised up the right people at the right time,
right.
and knowing your heart and so forth, knowing you're going to wrestle with this at the same time, and then there's also the spiritual warfare component. So you have a guy here who's a pastor of a church who has the gift of discouragement, and then just the icing on the cake is backing into the telephone pole, just little things, and then the despondency. But that the fact that you remember the 8:14 is so significant because it was a transitional, kind of an epiphany in your life, and why those people responded to you and how he orchestrated that behind the scenes. But then he checks you out and recognizes this is a man who is really willing to go for broke. And he doesn't know where he's going, but God does. And that comes down to that's a powerful story. And it's a redemptive story, isn't it? And many have heard it.
Yeah, and I tell you one other thing that I thought was so pivotal for me. We got that little bit of money up in Gainesville, but then it was really hard to get other people involved. And we had a corporation that wanted to give us 200 acres up around LJ, and then a well-known sports figure in Atlanta wanted to give us 80 acres on Carter's Lake. And he went on to say that if you take this land on Carter's Lake, you'll never have to worry about money. We're going to make sure that this undertaking you're wanting to do will be funded in perpetuity. So those were in Northwest Georgia. I really felt called to Northeast Georgia.
I see.
But when those two people offered that, it was so subtle, Ken, but I felt my dependency going from God to those two people.
So you could discern that, yeah.
And then when I said no, I thanked him graciously, but I said, that's not where I think God's calling us to do this. When I said no, I felt almost my dependence go from those men back to God. And it was almost a physical feeling of I had suddenly put all my marbles in their basket, and God was sort of an addendum, to be real honest. And then when I felt convicted that wasn't the way to go, it's almost as if, gosh, I left God behind a little in that. And it sort of felt I'm back where I need to be.
Yes.
Independence on him.
So there's a kind of interesting, one was a discouragement, but this was a kind of encouragement, but a different direction from what you felt you were called to do. And it was so appealing on its own level, but you discerned that ultimately I'd be depending upon them and less on God. And so there was a kind of like a test.
Right, maybe,
To me, that was when it was there are these integrity. You know what I mean by this. You get that God gives you these integrity checks, and He gives you then some adversity to set you back, and then He'll test you to see if this other thing, which seems to be easy pickings, is not it. But you, in your heart of hearts, knew that you had a mission that was northeast or not northwest. But as I look back, and you can see those are Ebenezer's, those are stones of remembrance that you have marked together. And again, it's the grace of God that you were able to return to Him, because I don't know how many might have done though. That sounds so, even when I was hearing it, I said, man, that sounds good to me.
But it's funny. I think we spend a lot of our lives wanting to become independent of our dependence on God.
I think that's a good way of putting it. Yeah. A lot of times we do not because we like the illusion of autonomy. And it seems to me that the human heart is wired that way. And virtually every day I have to do a Copernican revolution where I go from a heliocentric to a geocentric to a heliocentric world. That is to say, in my case, to go from an egocentric to a Christocentric. And every morning I have to kind of put that on as a realization, and I just have that need for me to do that. So it becomes a very powerful test and temptation for me to do that, indeed. As I look at my own life, these tests are markers, and they are signposts along the way. And there's an integrity check. There's your own sense of where I'm called to be, and where I am going to be tempted to put myself back on the throne and have the illusion of autonomy. That's I think it's kind of a pull that we all have. So for me to give it back to him each morning is to do that, and because as I'm sure you heard, a living sacrifice can crawl off the altar.
Right, right.
So, yeah,
it's a daily thing.
It's a great story, though. At that moment, that test, it seems to me, that brought you back and clarified, in retrospect, your journey. So it's always wise, isn't it, to remember, as you say, to cultivate not only a heart of gratitude, but a heart of remembrance, because we tend to have a way of forgetting.
Short memory.
We do. Gratitude is has a short half-life. Yeah. So there you are. It's after having done that, then what's your next step?
Well, we found this land that we loved in Hall County, and it was owned by a bank in Atlanta, and I said, I want to buy that land. It was 180 acres, and they said, we're not going to sell to you and have to foreclose on an orphanage. You talk a lot about God and Jesus, but that doesn't pay the bills. We're just not going to take that risk. And my prayer became, Ken, God, you can change the minds of kings. And there's some kings in Atlanta whose minds need to be changed.
Yeah.
And they called back 2 weeks later and they said, okay, we're going to sell. This is a deal, no financing. You have 120 days to raise about $150,000, no financing. And they go, how much money do you have? And I said, $15,000. And they go, we want that as non-refundable earnest money.
Huh.
And I signed that contract in Decatur, and at the courthouse in Decatur, where their attorney was. And I'll never forget, this is another one of those markers. I remember, so I gave them everything I had, $15,000. And I remember going up to the land, and I sat under this pine tree, and I know where it is. And I just said, God, what have I done? And never before or never since that I almost physically felt God's presence saying, Eddie, get off your knees and let me show you what I'm going to give you. And for the next half hour, I just felt this incredible closeness to the Lord. It got to where I couldn't hardly stand it. It was just too much. And yeah, but I just felt like Jesus was right there with me, and this was going to be the home of Eagle Ranch. And it was so funny, Ken, as we got closer and closer to the deadline, we had a week and we needed $40,000. And so people on my board, I found this out many years later, they're trying to figure out how to finance the rest of it. And I'm just thinking, the money's going to be there. And it goes back to remembrance. I know the money's going to be there. And it was. We got it almost on the last day. So we bought the land, and that sort of set us philosophically that we don't do anything until we have all the money. So that's just been our historical philosophy. So.
Yeah, a philosophy that's really a biblical philosophy of realizing it's all His.
You're right.
We're stewards of it. We don't own anything, and we're going to be accountable to Him. What year was that when you?
That was 83.
83. Wow.
Yeah. It was.
That was not long.
No, it was, and it was a recession going on right around there too. So that you go 150,000 today's not as much money, but it was a lot of money back then.
Yes,
that's a lot of money today, but not like it was back then with the recession and very little credibility.
Wow. So what's your next steps then? So then that was 83. So then you begin to put together a plan.
Yeah, we started just having boys, and it sort of goes to what you said. God's revelation tends to be progressive, and we believe that need drives vision. And so we went, gosh, we have these boys, but what about sisters of our boys? They're being placed in South Atlanta, Columbus, Macon. And so we started girls. And then we go, well, these at-risk children tend to be 2 to 3 years behind. The public schools are having a really hard time remediating our kids.
Yes.
So let's do a school. Then we go, a lot of kids can't be counseled in four walls. They need experiential counseling. So let's do equine therapy. And then, so that's sort of how our program has evolved. And then about 10 years ago, I began thinking about succession. And either in the not-for-profit or for-profit, succession is just a train wreck. This leadership transition, I said, I just don't want that to be us.
Yes. And
so I started thinking about 10 years before, and then 5 years before I was going to step down. I was 60 years old. I said, at 65, I want to have named him my successor. And I told the board, and it was so interesting. COVID happened, and so I wanted to lead through COVID. And then right after that, we started looking. We hired a search firm, and I knew, Ken, I didn't really believe that we would find this person through the search firm. That's just not the way. God can work that way. I know He can. But I just felt that it would be a different way. And so the search firm worked really hard for us, but we couldn't find the person. I mean, they probably looked at 300 people. And so finally we parted ways and just said, thank you, you've worked hard, but we're going to take a different path. And about two weeks after that, a friend of mine called. Matter of fact, the guy from Chick-fil-A who got me the first Powder Springs, he was my first board member. He called, and he said, well, how are you doing? I said, well, I'm doing fine. He goes, well, have y'all found your successor? And I go, no. We're still thinking and praying about it. And he goes, well, tell me what this person looks like. And I started doing this, telling the different character qualities. And he goes, Eddie, I think I've got your person. He's at Chick-fil-A, and he's one of the most purposeful people I've ever met. He's been with us for 10 years. And so the person that got me the first place to stay, my first board member, identified the successor at Eagle Ranch. And so his name's John Shackelford, and he left a promising career at Chick-fil-A to come to Eagle Ranch. And so we're in the middle of transitioning to him. But it's sort of that theme of God working in His own way, in His own time. And it just gives you...
It's incredible, isn't it, how this individual that He raises up more than once.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like the Spirit of God raises up a person, and He's called to be alongside of you. But then He comes back after many years, and then another. That's not accidental, and it's right. It's not He can do a regular search thing, but often He does it through organic dynamics of relationships, and that's how the Spirit will then prompt another person. He's being prepared, not knowing it's going to be for something like this.
Yeah,
what a great story.
And his name's David Salyers, and some of your listeners will know David, but. It's amazing, and I've moved to starting the Wing Center, which is for outpatient counseling, and retreats, and I'm doing nonprofit mentoring. So I've been doing that for 3 years and helping John Shackelford, the new executive director, just giving advice when I'm asked, and sometimes when I'm not asked,
and sometimes when you're not asked.
I have to apologize to him, but he is doing a great job. He's a gifted leader. He loves my people that came with me, and he's just a real gift to me and Eagle Ranch.
So the Wing Center, that's what I saw when I was there last.
Yes.
So that's a wonderfully new development that, and you're doing some things along the lines with Gary Moon and some people like that as well. Yes,
and the whole thing, our outpatient counseling, we will have had 5,000 counseling sessions this year alone, but the retreats. My heart is to help those who help others. So we're doing stuff with missionaries when they come off the field, with pastors, with cancer survivors, with married couples, and we're doing stuff through Richmont. So, we just want to pour into people who help others so that they're serving out of an overflow and not a deficit.
That's right. Yeah.
So.
Yeah, and that's really what life's about, is approaching relationships out of the overflow of Christ in you rather than out of a deficiency modality where you're using other people to get your needs met.
You're right.
It's a really big pull, isn't it?
Yeah, and especially for those in ministry,
Yeah.
it's almost it's almost as if there's something inherently holy about working out of a deficit.
Yes.
And it's not. And it took me down a
Yes.
dark road
Yeah.
of just complete burnout, such that I know I'll be able to come back to
Yes.
Eagle Ranch after
Yes.
15 years. And I think God calls us to live in healthy rhythms. And
Healthy rhythms is a good way to put it. So what's he teaching you right now? You're looking for something right now. What do you want to...
Yeah,
what
so
are you
that's a
looking
great
for?
question, Ken. And so I have a spiritual director. He's in Canada. He's an Irishman. And he asked me about 8 months ago, he says, Eddie, what do you want Jesus to do for you? He said, I'm not talking about your family or anybody. He said, I want to know what you want Jesus to do for you. And I said, John, I don't know. So the next month he called. He said, Eddie, what do you want Jesus to do for you? And I said, John, I don't know. And he goes, I tell you what I want you to do. He said, I want you to picture Jesus sitting in a chair across from you with his elbows on his knees, looking at you and saying, Eddie, what do you want me to do for you? And that was sort of a turning point for me, because where I see Jesus spatially, if he's in a galaxy far, far away, it really affects how I relate to him. It
Sure.
becomes more transactional.
Right, I hear you. That makes sense.
And so we're right there. And I thought about two things. So there was a little boy at Eagle Ranch, and he was interviewed by Georgia Public Television, and the reporter asked him, they said, Taylor, what do you want for yourself? He goes, well, I'm not sure, but I can tell you one thing. I want to be rich and famous.
What a surprise.
I know, but you know what's interesting? It's such a well-worn path, because in Mark, Jesus asked James and John, what do you want me to do for you?
Yeah.
And we want to be on your right and we your left.
Yeah.
We want to share in your glory. We want to be famous.
Mm-hmm.
Isn't that interesting?
It is.
And
It is
and
indeed.
then and then you get to Bartimaeus, who just had this guttural, I just want to see. But that physical sight became spiritual sight. And so the more I thought about it, I thought about all the things. And you know what I came back, Ken, is I just want to be wise. And they said the heart of wisdom is to number your days aright. And I remember, Jim Webb.
Sure.
It was a dear friend. He was the best man in my wedding.
Good man,
And Jim,
yeah. Mm-hmm.
when he was 70 years old, he and I were having lunch. He said, Eddie, I've decided to segment the remaining years of my life in 5-year increments. He said, I just can't mentor everybody that comes to me. So, from 70 to 75, I'm going to do so many, 75 to 80, and then 80 to 85. My first thought was, I hope I make the cut.
Of course.
But
yeah.
but he, there was a lot of wisdom in that Jim was counting his days aright.
Yes.
And I think
He was a wise man.
He was very wise, and he really poured into me. The other thing was the ancient path.
Yes.
And so I feel like that's what I want, Ken, in Jesus sitting across me. I just want to be wise. I want to look at life from an eternal perspective. I want to become more of an apprentice
Yes.
of who you are. So that's where I came. That's where I am in my journey right now.
Yeah,
So
I think
anyway.
our journeys are overlapping in that respect, because at the simplest of all things is that pursuit of the one thing most needful, the treasure hidden in the field, the pearl of great price, the treasuring things according to their true value.
Yeah.
And so wisdom really, as Jonathan Edwards put it, was to treat things according to their true value, not according to the values of this world.
Right.
Even the church will put wrong values on things. And so instead, what does God say the thing is worth? And then that's the eternal perspective. It's building a heavenly portfolio rather than an earthbound one, but to leverage the passing goods of this world for the eternal greatness of the next, and so forth. And so I think you're seeing that. And that's what Solomon wanted too. The sad tragedy that he lost that wisdom later in his life, but that numbering my days, and I find myself living more in light of expecting the return and hoping and living with the reward, for they were looking to the reward and they were anticipating who he is and seeing themselves as pilgrims and sojourners and wayfarers and strangers upon this world, because they knew that they don't have a habitation here. They're tenants. And so to recognize that's wisdom, is to realize, and then to have 2 days in your calendar, today and that day, and to leave each day in light as if it was my last. And so what does that look like for me? And I think that is wisdom. So what do I seek? It's, well, when I asked that first question that Jesus asked, what do you seek? What are you looking for? My answer now is basically to know you, basically, that I may know him more clearly is what I seek. But that's the fundamental question. What do I seek? And then who do you say I am? And that is to, man, love you more dearly. And do you love me more than these? Follow you more nearly. So it comes down to that simplicity of the intention of the heart. What does the heart desire more than anything else? Because the heart will always make room for what it treasures. So wisdom, I think we're talking about the same thing here.
Yeah.
And that's a great thing to hear, that story.
Yeah. And you mentioned it. It's an expectancy of God's activity in us and around us.
Yes.
To be able to see the unseen. Because that's really even more reality than the seductive scene, right?
Absolutely so.
And that's part of my journey, is to be sensitive to the unseen.
Yeah, that's a treasure. To treasure the unseen over the seen, and the not yet over the now. Faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. So it's hoped for, you don't have it yet. It's not now, and it's unseen. So how do we take this risk of pursuing the unseen over the seen and the not yet over the now? And yet he invites us to do that, and he incarnates that. And so it's a rich journey ahead for you, and I pray for myself as well, as we continue to consider what's before us, and to recognize, as I'm getting old enough, people are dying like flies around me. And to be honest with you, I would see this more and more with the people, my loved ones and so forth, who are diminishing. This is a tragedy, but it becomes a comedy in the next act. And so when we see the next act begin, then this apparent tragedy is a story that ends well.
It's a severe mercy.
It's a severe mercy.
Yes.
And he gives us, and it's adversity, as we know. I often teach that there are 4 things that God uses in our lives for our own spiritual growth, and one's the Word of God, and the other is prayer. And then that's why I created Hammock to Prayer, praying Scripture back to God, combine them. But the third one is the community of believers, and so we can't grow it alone. But then the fourth one, suffering and adversity, because it's a necessary thing to enter into the fellowship of his sufferings, being conformed to his death, and so that except a grain of wheat fall into the ground and die. So I'm now seeing this more along the metaphor of a biblical, of a creational metaphor. So being a scientist, I'm taking my cue from the mysteries of the physical world. So when I look at for example, the butterfly cycle, I now see it goes from the eggs, and the eggs are, if I had just had a collection of all the species of butterfly, they'd be gorgeous and beautiful, but they're not the end. The next one is the caterpillar, as you know, and I have a collection of those that they're wonderful, strange and goofy looking things, leaf eating wonders. But then, as you know, it goes into the pupa stage, and that's where it goes into the chrysalis, and it forges, and the idea of it making its own burial chamber. And then it liquefies into goo, and then reconstitutes into a entirely new body plan, which when it emerges, it's no longer a leaf-eating wonder, but a muncher, but a nectar-drinking wonder, where it flies. And so now, so this life is, this body is to the next life. as the caterpillar is to the butterfly. It's the same, but it's really different. But it's mysterious stuff. And that's why I see the next creation as being like that as well. So you and I feel like I'm being sometimes in the process of being liquefied even while I'm alive. Because he must increase and we must decrease. But in order for that life to be forged and formed in us. So I think that your answer is, I'm just confirming that this seems like the right answer. That you give me a heart of wisdom that I may serve you and above all other goods, and realize when I have you, I have everything else thrown in.
Yes,
that's a powerful word. So it's a great journey we're both on, and the journey of desire. And let's see what God does in the days ahead. You know, the days are short, but He's called you to a purpose, and I think many lives have been transformed as a result. And the best is yet to come.
It's true.
Yeah. Thank you for joining me, my friend.
Thank you, Ken.
Enjoyed our time together.
Great being with you.
Yeah.
Thank you for being a part of the Explorers podcast. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you next time.